Tempting as it was to get out on the bike and have a bit of fun as soon as I bought it, I decided that I'd already pushed my luck riding it with the tyres as they were. So the sensible thing to do was give it a good clean, which would give me a good chance to give the bike a proper checking over and also get some new tyres on it. I did find 3 issues. Firstly, the broken front mudguard down where it mounts on the right hand side. Secondly, the chain guard, which is very loose. And third was the registration plate light, which was just hanging by the wires. As would be expected, the chain was filthy, clearly hadn't been properly cleaned for a long time. And of course anything within flinging distance of the chain had a good thick coating of old chain grease on it as well. So all this needed to come off. The grease on the rim was particularly stubborn, and eventually I had to resort to something stronger than muck off to get this off. With the bike cleaned, the next job was to get the wheels off to get the tyres swapped out. I did use an impact wrench to get the nut on the rear axle moving, and with it loosened off a bit I could move on to removing the caliper. First I took out the retaining pin for the brake pads. Before loosening and then removing the 2 mounting bolts. I gave all 3 a quick visual check, and as we can see in the video here, they were all quite clean with no corrosion. I was then able to remove the caliper and the brake pads. I also pulled off the gaiter from the top mounting bolt. These sort of parts have a habit of falling off at an inopportune moment and getting lost. The disc was visibly worn, but I gave it a quick check with a micrometer, 5.15mm, which I strongly suspect is well below the wear limit. And finally, before removing the axle, I loosened off the adjusters on both sides of the swing arm. The axle was a bit of a bugger to get out. I am holding the weight of the wheel here with my right hand, and even with a plastic mallet it was reluctant to move. With a bit of perseverance I did eventually manage to knock it far enough that I could get hold of it and pull it from the other side. And once I'd unhooked the chain, the wheel came out. Onto the front wheel, and the first thing was to loosen off both the mounting bolts on both of the calipers. Next, the clamping bolts on the bottom of the right fork. And with both of those loosened, I could then loosen off the nut on the end of the axle. This was really tight, so I used an impact wrench to loosen it up before getting a big spanner on there. To remove the axle, I just needed to loosen off the 2 clamping bolts on the bottom of the left fork leg, drop off the nut from the axle itself, and then pull it through with a bit of help from a hammer and drift to get it moving. It did take a bit of manoeuvring to get both of the calipers off the discs, and with hindsight I should have loosened off the front mudguard. Despite my earlier efforts at cleaning the bike, the sprocket was still filthy, so I gave this a good clean. I also took the opportunity to pop the seal, clean out the bearing, re-grease it and reseat the seal. Ideally the seal should have been replaced, but I'll come back to that later when I pull the bike off the road. We can see here why the rear axle was so difficult to remove, and even after a good clean with degreaser we can see a lot of corrosion on the surface. To remove the corrosion I used some Scotch-Brite whilst holding the axle in the lathe. For the broken mudguard I did do a temporary fix. Unfortunately I don't appear to have taken any pictures before I put it back on the bike, but basically I taped the outside and used a small amount of araldite on the inside to hopefully stop the crack from getting any worse. Everything else that came off the bike got a good clean before being refitted. To deal with the loose chain guard, I replaced the old rusty bolts with some new stainless items. There were only 2 bolts on the bike, whereas there should have been 3. The missing bolt, which should have been located here at the front of the chain guard, has no corresponding thread in the hole or captive nut, and will need to be dealt with at some point in the future. I decided not to bother with fixing the number plate light at this time. It will suffice in the short term while I have a bit of fun on the bike. For the new tyres, I went with a set of Bridgestone Battle Axe S22s. I've already got these on my BMW, so I thought I'd stick with something I'm already familiar with. I had the tyres fitted onto the rims by our local go-to man, Mark at Ride-In Tyres of Reading. Putting the wheels back onto the bike was pretty much a reverse of what I'd done in terms of taking them off. All bolts were torqued down to the recommended settings from the manual. I should also call out that before torquing down the mounting bolts for the caliper, I had aligned the wheel. Getting the calipers back over the discs on the front wheel was the fiddliest part of the job. With the wheels back in the frame, all I needed to do was lube and adjust the chain, torque down the main axle nut, and lock off the adjusters. After a few hours effort, the bike is looking nice and clean, and with the new tyres it is also road legal. So before the winter sets in properly here in the UK, the intent is to get out and have a bit of fun over the next couple of weeks before I pull the bike off the road and start preparing it properly for the track. If you liked the video, please press like, and of course subscribe to the channel if you want to see this build continue. Thanks for watching.